My father, an arrogant real estate tycoon, laughed aloud in that freezing courtroom. He stared at my empty lawyer's chair, entirely certain I was just a pawn waiting to be crushed. He forgot one thing. The woman who raised me, my grandmother Linda, never taught me to surrender. From her grave, she left behind a silent, devastating trump card. It was a single signature carrying enough power to utterly obliterate the empire he had spent 40 years building. Hello, listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories. I hope you are having a peaceful day. Recently, YouTube disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can cover their living expenses and continue bringing you more great stories. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. My name is Sadie Spencer, and this is my story. It had been less than 48 hours since I was pulled from a literal mudslide in South America. I did not even have the time to change. I stepped into the misty, freezing air of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon, wearing my thick, soil-stained field uniform of the Apex Geo-Recovery Directorate. My boots left faint trails of dried South American earth on the pristine stone pathways of the cemetery. I was here to bury my grandmother, Linda. The gathering felt less like a funeral and more like a high-profile corporate mixer. As I approached the lavish black canopy set up near the burial site, the stark contrast between me and my family became violently clear. My mother and my younger sister, Chloe, were dressed in custom black designer gowns that looked as if they were tailored for a red carpet event. They held delicate black umbrellas, their faces perfectly contoured, not a single tear ruining their expensive makeup. Chloe was actually laughing quietly with a local politician, swapping business cards over the freshly turned soil. They were networking. Then, there was my father, Robert Spencer, a billionaire real estate developer whose heart had calcified into concrete decades ago. He stood near the casket, flanked by two men in charcoal suits, looking at his gold watch rather than the grave. When his eyes finally flicked over to me, they narrowed with instant, unmistakable disgust. He took in my heavy boots, the tactical jacket, and the exhaustion etched deep into my face. He stepped away from his associates and walked over to me. His voice was a low, polished sneer that barely masked his contempt. "You could not even bother to dress decently for your own grandmother. Still playing your little game, Sadie? Still pretending to save the world to escape the real responsibilities of an adult?" I clenched my jaw, staring into his cold, calculating eyes. "I coordinate disaster relief, Dad. Real people die. It is not a game." He let out a short, hollow scoff. "It is the perfect game for a failure who cannot handle the weight of the family business. Stand in the back. Do not embarrass me in front of the investors." He turned his back on me, dismissing me completely. I stood at the edge of the crowd, an outsider in my own bloodline, watching as they lowered the only person who had ever truly loved me into the ground. The wake was held at a luxury banquet hall Robert had rented out. It was a sickening display of wealth. Waiters circulated with crystal trays of champagne and caviar. The air hummed with the sound of clinking glasses and muted, cheerful conversations. I stood alone by a large window, gripping a cup of black coffee, feeling the profound, crushing isolation of this broken family. My attention was violently snapped back to the room when Robert stood up at the head of a long mahogany table. He tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute, demanding silence. The room quieted down. He offered a practiced, artificial smile to the room full of developers, bankers, and local officials. "I want to thank you all for being here today to honor my mother," Robert began, his tone dripping with false reverence. "Linda loved these mountains, and to ensure her legacy lives on, I am thrilled to announce that we are moving forward with the Summit Project. By next spring, we will begin leveling her old, expansive timber property to clear the way for the new luxury ski resort and spa. It will be the crown jewel of the Spencer portfolio." The room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. My blood ran completely cold. That sprawling, ancient wooden cabin was not just property. It was her sanctuary. It was the place she had raised me when my parents were too busy building their empire to notice I existed. I slammed my coffee cup down on the windowsill. The loud thud echoed, cutting through the applause. "You cannot do that," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I could barely contain. I marched toward the table. "You are not touching her cabin. It was her home. It is all we have left of her." Robert's fake smile vanished. He glared at me, the veins in his neck tightening. Before he could speak, my mother stepped in, her voice as sharp as glass. "Sadie, please, do not cause a scene. You have absolutely no right to dictate what happens to that land." "No right?" I shot back. She loved that forest. She would never want it paved over for some sterile resort. Chloe rolled her eyes, swirling her champagne. "Oh, please, Sadie. Stop being so incredibly selfish. You are literally never home. You spend your life running around in the mud in third world countries, and now you want to come back and play the devoted granddaughter? You gave up your right to have an opinion on this family's assets the day you walked away." "It is not an asset," I pleaded, looking around the room at the blank, uncaring faces of my relatives. "It is a memory." "It is prime real estate," Robert corrected me, his voice a finalized, brutal verdict. "The papers are already in motion. You have no say in this, Sadie. You never did." I looked from my father, to my mother, to my sister. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This family had lost its humanity a long time ago. They did not see Grandmother Linda's death as a tragedy, a loss, or even a moment to grieve. To them, her passing was nothing more than a massive, highly profitable land-clearing opportunity. And I was just a minor, irritating obstacle in their way. I refused the driver my mother offered. I could not spend a single second inside their sprawling mansion, suffocated by marble floors and empty pleasantries. Instead, I rented a cheap sedan and drove the winding, unlit roads back to the only place that had ever felt like home. The drive took exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes, weaving deep into the dense, silent forests of the Cascade Mountains. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the heavy wooden structure sat quietly under the moonlight, shrouded in a gentle mist. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside. Immediately, the familiar, comforting scent of aged pine wood and sweet cinnamon tea wrapped around me like a warm blanket. The silence here was not oppressive like the silence in my father's house. It was a healing, breathing silence. I dropped my duffel bag by the entryway and walked slowly through the living room. Running my fingers over the worn fabric of her favorite armchair, the memories came rushing back. For 20-odd years, while my father looked right through me, dismissing me because I was not the ruthless, profit-driven heir he demanded, my grandmother Linda had been my shield. She was the one who saw my restless spirit. When I was 19 years old and feeling utterly worthless, she was the one who handed me the brochure for the Apex Geo-Recovery Directorate. She told me that true value was not measured by bank accounts, but by the lives you touch and the earth you heal. She gave me the strength to build a life 10,000 miles away from Robert Spencer's toxic empire. I made my way to her small study at the back of the cabin. The moonlight spilled across her heavy mahogany reading desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to organize it, to touch the things she had touched. I neatly stacked her old notebooks and polished the brass lamp. Above the desk hung her absolute favorite landscape painting, a beautiful oil canvas depicting the very forest that surrounded this cabin. As I reached up to straighten the heavy wooden frame, my fingers brushed against something stiff tucked securely between the canvas backing and the frame itself. I paused, my brow furrowing in confusion. I carefully lifted the painting off its brass hook and laid it flat on the desk. Sliding my nails under the edge, I pulled out a small, severely yellowed piece of paper. It had been folded precisely in half. My heart began to beat a little faster against my ribs. I slowly unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the strokes carried an unmistakable, fierce determination. It was my grandmother's handwriting. "To my little Sadie," the note began, "if your father ever dares to lay a hand on this forest, you must find the red leather book hidden beneath the floorboards in the attic." A chill ran directly down my spine. The slow, creeping sensation of a mystery unfolding took hold of me. She knew. Even in her final days, she knew exactly what Robert would try to do the moment she was gone. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and climbed the narrow, creaking wooden stairs to the attic. The air up here was stale and cold. I swept the beam of light across the dusty, unfinished room. The note said the floorboards. I dropped to my knees, feeling along the edge of the wooden planks near the far window, right where she used to sit and watch the winter snow. About 5 feet from the wall, one of the planks gave slightly under my weight. I wedged my fingers into the tight gap and pulled with all my strength. The old wood groaned in protest before popping loose, revealing a dark, hollow cavity underneath. Reaching inside, my hand brushed against cold leather. I pulled it out into the beam of the flashlight. It was a thick, antique book, bound in deep crimson red. The title had worn away decades ago. I opened the heavy cover, but there were no pages. The entire inside of the book had been meticulously hollowed out. Nestled in the center of the carved-out recess were two objects. The first was a long silver safety deposit box key, stamped with a serial number. The second was a thick, textured business card. I picked up the card, wiping away a thin layer of dust. The bold, embossed black letters across the center read, "Veronica Sterling." Beneath the name, smaller text simply stated, "Corporate Crisis Management." There was no address, only a 10-digit Seattle phone number. Who was Veronica Sterling? And why did my grandmother, a woman who spent her life baking pies and tending to pine trees, have a hidden safety deposit key and the contact of a corporate fixer? Before I could even process the weight of the discovery, the harsh, artificial vibration of my cell phone shattered the quiet tension in the room. The bright screen illuminated the dark attic. It was a text message from my sister Chloe. "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp, Dad's lawyer is coming to lock down the cabin and begin the asset seizure. Be smart, pack your bags tonight, and get lost." I stared at the glowing words, my grip tightening around the silver key until the metal bit into my palm. They thought they had already won. They thought they were dealing with the same helpless girl they had pushed away so many years ago. I looked back down at the business card, my grandmother's final whisper from the grave, and a quiet, burning resolve ignited inside my chest. It was exactly 7:45 in the morning when the brutal crunch of heavy tires on gravel shattered the mountain quiet. I was standing by the kitchen sink, gripping a cold mug, when I looked out the window to see my grandmother's sanctuary being invaded. 4 massive black utility vehicles had surrounded the perimeter. A team of 6 men wearing neon surveying vests immediately jumped out and began aggressively driving wooden stakes into the soft earth, unrolling bright orange tape across the flower beds my grandmother had spent decades tending. Before I could even step out the front door, it swung violently open. My father, Robert, strode into the living room as if he already owned the air inside it. Right on his heels was a man I did not recognize, a sharp-featured man with slicked-back hair, wearing a custom-tailored gray suit that looked entirely absurd inside a rustic woodland cabin. "I see you did not heed your sister's warning," Robert stated, his voice devoid of any familial warmth. He gestured casually to the man beside him. "This is Vance, my senior legal counsel. We are here to officially secure the premises." Vance did not even offer a greeting. He walked straight to the wooden dining table, unclasped his expensive leather briefcase, and slapped a single thick document down on the surface. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice tight. "That is a certified medical affidavit, signed by an independent psychiatric specialist," Vance replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "It unequivocally confirms that during the last 18 months of her life, your grandmother suffered from severe cognitive decline and early-stage dementia. This legally invalidates any and all previous wills, trusts, or verbal promises she might have made regarding this property." My blood boiled instantly. That is an absolute lie. I spoke to her on the phone every single Sunday. Her mind was sharper than yours, Vance. You forged a medical document to steal her land. Robert let out a tired, dramatic sigh, stepping forward to block my view of his lawyer. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a sleek, dark checkbook. With a gold fountain pen, he quickly scribbled across the paper, tore the slip out, and held it out to me. "I am trying to be generous, Sadie," Robert said, his eyes mocking me. "This is a cashier's check for $50,000. Consider it a charitable donation to whatever mud-wallowing relief fund you work for. Take the money. Sign the inheritance waiver Vance has prepared. Pack your duffel bag, and disappear back to whatever third-world jungle you crawled out of." I looked at the slip of paper fluttering in his hand. $50,000. To him, it was pocket change. To me, it was a profound, sickening insult to the woman who had built this home. I reached out, took the check from his fingers, and deliberately, slowly, tore it squarely in half. Then I tore it again, letting the pieces flutter to the wooden floorboards. The mask of the generous patriarch instantly melted off Robert's face. The predatory monster beneath revealed itself. He stepped so close I could smell the bitter espresso on his breath. "You really think you can play games with me?" Robert whispered, his voice dropping into a dangerous, venomous register. "I have financial leverage over every major banking institution on the West Coast. By noon today, I can have your personal accounts frozen under suspicion of international fraud. And your precious Apex Geo-Recovery Directorate? One phone call to my friends at the major news networks, and I will paint your little charity as a corrupt, money-laundering syndicate. I will bury your career so deep you will not be able to volunteer at a local soup kitchen, let alone lead international disaster teams. Do not test my power, little girl." I was completely cornered. A wave of absolute sickening disgust washed over me. He was perfectly willing to destroy thousands of innocent lives depending on AGRD just to punish me for standing in his way. I opened my mouth to scream at him, to fight back, but then a sudden, vivid image flashed in my mind. The red leather book, the silver key, the hidden message. I realized in that split second that reacting with rage was exactly what he expected from his helpless daughter. I swallowed the burning anger rising in my throat. I forced every muscle in my face to relax, adopting an expression of pure, icy blankness. I did not say a single word. I simply turned my back on the billionaire and his attack dog, picked up my duffel bag from the hallway, and walked out the front door, leaving them standing in the silence of their own arrogance. I got into my rental sedan, turned the key, and pressed hard on the gas pedal. I did not drive south toward the international airport. Instead, I merged onto the northbound interstate. I drove straight for 3 hours, pushing the speed limit through the dense evergreen forests, heading directly into the chaotic, towering steel skyline of downtown Seattle. It was time to find a bank vault and dial a 10-digit number. The elevator doors slid open on the 55th floor of a sleek, hyper-secure glass tower in downtown Seattle. I stepped out into a sprawling penthouse that functioned more like a high-tech financial command center than a residence. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark waters of Puget Sound was Veronica Sterling. Wall Street Whispers used to call her the Iron Lady. She was a legendary corporate crisis manager, a woman who had orchestrated the survival and collapse of massive corporations before allegedly vanishing into a quiet retirement over 10 years ago. She wore a pristine white tailored suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp, immaculate bob. She radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying control. I set the heavy steel lockbox I had retrieved from the downtown bank vault directly onto her glass dining table. After opening the safe deposit box and calling the 10-digit number, I had barely spoken my grandmother's name before Veronica commanded me to come straight to this address. I quickly brought her up to speed, explaining my father's brutal ambush that morning and the forged medical affidavit claiming my grandmother had severe cognitive decline. Veronica let out a sharp, frigid laugh that echoed off the glass walls. Dementia? Robert always was a remarkably unoriginal liar, she said, walking over to pour 2 glasses of sparkling water. Your grandmother was about as naive as a starving wolf. Linda did not spend the last 5 years of her life just baking pies and knitting sweaters, Sadie. She spent every waking hour hunting. Veronica walked over to the table and unlocked the steel box using my silver key. Inside was a massive, intimidating stack of financial documents, heavily redacted bank statements, and encrypted offshore ledgers. She began spreading them out across the glass surface like a 5-star general mapping a complex battlefield. Look closely at this, Veronica commanded, tapping a thick manicured finger on a consolidated balance sheet. Your father parades around the country as a brilliant billionaire. It is a complete and utter illusion. His entire real estate empire is a hollow shell drowning in toxic debt. He has recklessly over-leveraged every single one of his commercial properties to fund his lavish lifestyle and his failing expansion projects. Right now, he is facing margin calls and aggressive loan defaults to the tune of $450 million. I stared at the staggering, multi-million-dollar figures printed across the pages, feeling the floor physically tilt beneath my boots. So the luxury ski resort project on my grandmother's land is his desperate attempt to survive. It is his only remaining lifeline, Veronica confirmed, her tone turning grim. He desperately needs to liquidate her pristine, unencumbered land to satisfy his most dangerous creditors. Without the capital from that specific land sale, Robert Spencer goes entirely bankrupt within exactly 30 days. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend the sheer monumental scale of the deception. But how did he manage to get into this much financial trouble without the primary board of directors or the regulatory agencies noticing? Veronica's eyes darkened, turning as sharp and unforgiving as obsidian. Because he committed the ultimate corporate sin. That is the true, sickening horror hiding in these folders. She deliberately pulled a specific red-tabbed folder from the bottom of the pile and opened it for me to see. Decades ago, your grandmother established the Foundational Family Trust, which legally held 51% of the original company's voting shares. Robert secretly forged documents to pledge those foundational shares as collateral, securing high-interest cash loans from unregulated, dangerous shadow lenders. It was wildly illegal. If he defaults on those specific loans, the lenders do not just take his empty buildings, they seize the entire Spencer family legacy. They take the name, the history, everything. And your grandmother Linda tracked down every single detail of this treason. My breath caught sharply in my throat. My father had not just mortgaged his own future, he had secretly cannibalized the very roots of our family. Veronica walked over to a biometric steel wall safe, entered a complex numeric code, and pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed tightly with dark red wax. She walked back and pressed it firmly into my hands. The heavy parchment felt like a loaded weapon. Your grandmother spent her final months working directly with me to construct a flawless, inescapable legal trap, Veronica said, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding whisper. This envelope is the jaws of that trap. Tomorrow morning is the official probate hearing. Robert and his corrupt lawyer will absolutely expect you to walk in begging for a pathetic cash settlement. They will be completely drunk on their own arrogance. She leaned in close, her gaze piercing right through my defenses. Your job is to let them be utterly complacent. Let them dig their own grave in front of the judge. And most importantly, you must step into that courtroom entirely alone. Do you understand me?" I nodded slowly, my fingers tracing the hardened, blood-red wax. That night, I sat alone in the oppressive, heavy silence of a cheap motel room on the outskirts of Portland. I stared blankly at the sealed envelope resting on the flimsy wooden desk. The glowing digital clock on the bedside table read 2 o'clock in the morning. A violent, exhausting psychological war raged inside my head. Despite his cruelty, Robert was still my father. We shared the exact same blood. Pressing the metaphorical button hidden inside this envelope would not just humiliate him in a courtroom. It would utterly obliterate his entire existence, his public reputation, and quite possibly his physical freedom. Society constantly conditions us to protect our family at all costs, to forgive their transgressions because of shared DNA. But then my mind flashed back to the absolute coldness in his eyes at the funeral. I remembered my mother and sister laughing and networking over a fresh grave. I remembered his vile, remorseless threat to destroy my disaster relief organization and the thousands of vulnerable people who relied on it just to get his way. They had violently weaponized our bloodline. They had turned our family name into a corrupt, rotting disease that infected everything it touched. And my grandmother had chosen me to be the cure. I closed my eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and finally made my peace with the total destruction I was about to unleash. The morning of the probate hearing at the Multnomah County Courthouse arrived shrouded in a thick, suffocating gray storm. Relentless rain battered the towering stone columns of the building, matching the heavy, hostile atmosphere that seemed to seep into my very bones. As I walked up the wide concrete steps, just before 9 o'clock, the freezing downpour felt like an oppressive weight, trying to push me back. I wore a simple, unbranded charcoal business suit and tightly clutched my grandmother's worn leather briefcase to my chest to protect it from the weather. When I reached the brightly lit corridor on the 3rd floor, the contrast was violently jarring. My family was already there, occupying the center of the hallway like conquering royalty. Robert, my mother, and Chloe were surrounded by a literal tactical squad of 5 high-priced corporate attorneys, all wearing immaculate, custom-tailored navy and black suits. The air around them reeked of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. They were laughing loudly, swapping golf stories and chatting with an easy, booming confidence, treating this solemn legal proceeding as if it were a cheerful victory party at an exclusive country club. I did not stop to engage them. I kept my head high and pushed open the heavy oak double doors of courtroom number 7. The moment I stepped inside and walked down the center aisle, the lively chatter from my family's entourage entirely ceased. The sudden silence in the large wood-paneled room was deafening. I walked to the defendant's table and placed my battered leather briefcase down. I was completely alone. On the opposite side of the aisle, the plaintiff's table was crowded with Robert's legal team, frantically organizing glossy folders and whispering to each other. Robert strolled into the courtroom a moment later, pausing right behind his chair. He looked across the aisle at my solitary figure, at the empty wooden chair next to me where legal representation should have been sitting. He leaned back, crossing his arms, and let out a loud, theatrical laugh. He made absolutely sure the sound carried to every corner of the room. "Could not afford a lawyer?" Robert mocked, his voice dripping with triumphant poison. "You should have taken the money I offered. At least you would have had a bus ticket out of town when this is over." I did not blink. I did not offer him a single word in response. I simply sat down, resting my hands flat on the polished wooden table. A sharp knock from the bailiff commanded the room to rise. Judge Harrison, a stern, imposing man with decades of judicial experience carved into his face, swept into the room and took his seat at the high bench. He barely had time to open his initial case file before Vance, my father's lead attorney, sprang to his feet. Vance did not just present a case. He launched a rapid, aggressive theatrical performance. He paced the floor, his voice booming with fake sorrow and deep concern. For 20 straight minutes, he aggressively spun a web of total fabrications. He presented the forged medical documents with a flourish, painting a tragic, entirely fictional picture of my grandmother Linda as a frail, confused woman who had completely lost her grip on reality during her final 18 months. He portrayed Robert as the devoted, responsible son stepping in to save his mother's crumbling estate from ruin. Vance aggressively argued that any previous wills, any verbal promises made to me, were the manipulated delusions of a sick mind. He demanded that the court instantly invalidate my claims and execute an immediate, emergency transfer of the Mountain Properties deed directly to Robert Spencer to prevent financial degradation of the estate. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy. I could feel the collective weight of every gaze shifting toward me. The court clerks, the bailiff, and even Judge Harrison looked down at my empty table with a mixture of professional pity and quiet contempt. I looked like a foolish, stubborn child who had brought a knife to a nuclear war. But internally, a profound, eerie calm had washed over me. This was the exact arrogance Veronica Sterling had predicted. They were completely drunk on their own perceived power, totally blind to the ground shifting beneath their feet. I sat as still as a carved stone statue. I actively controlled my breathing, forcing my heart rate to slow down to a steady, rhythmic beat. I ignored Vance's booming voice entirely. Instead, I kept my eyes intensely, unblinkingly locked onto my father's smug, victorious face. Let him enjoy this exact second. Let him savor his imaginary triumph. The storm was coming, and I was going to be the one to bring it. The sharp, cracking echo of Judge Harrison's wooden gavel finally silenced Vance's theatrical tirade. The judge looked down at me, his expression a mix of strict formality and weary patience. "Does the defense have anything to present? Any witnesses or documents to submit before I make my ruling on the estate transfer?" I stood up slowly. The fabric of my simple suit brushed against the heavy oak chair. The courtroom was dead silent. I did not reach for a tissue. I did not beg. I simply unlatched the battered leather briefcase, pulled out the thick envelope sealed with dark red wax, and placed it squarely on the center of the defendant's table. "I have no witnesses," I said, my voice echoing clearly against the high ceiling. "I only bring the final answer from Linda Spencer." At that exact second, the massive brass-handled oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a violent thud. Every head in the room whipped around. Striding down the center aisle, exuding an aura of absolute terrifying authority, was Veronica Sterling. She wore a sharp pitch-black designer suit, carrying a sleek silver briefcase. The reaction on the plaintiff's side was instantaneous and catastrophic. Vance, who had been holding a gold fountain pen, literally dropped it. It clattered loudly onto the polished wood, rolling off the edge. But it was Robert whose reaction was truly magnificent. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His jaw went completely slack. He recognized her. Every corrupt billionaire on the West Coast knew the face of the Iron Lady, the sworn enemy of fraudulent financial empires. Veronica did not even glance at my father. She walked right past his table, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply like a ticking clock counting down to his destruction. She stepped up to the bench, gently taking the red wax-sealed envelope from my hands, and handed it directly to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "Your Honor," Veronica began, her voice smooth but lethal, "we are not here to submit a competing will regarding the mountain property. The cabin is entirely irrelevant to this proceeding. Instead, I am submitting certified, rigorously authenticated financial instruments proving that over the last 36 months, Linda Spencer systematically utilized her undisclosed, independent offshore assets to purchase every single high-interest shadow loan currently threatening the Spencer Real Estate Group." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Robert gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning pure white. "She bought his debt?" Judge Harrison asked, visibly stunned as he broke the wax seal and opened the heavy parchment. 100% of it, Veronica confirmed, turning her piercing gaze toward my father for the first time. Every toxic mortgage, every over-leveraged commercial loan, and every illegal pledge of the foundational family trust shares. Linda Spencer became the sole owner of a $450 million debt portfolio. She secretly became his absolute master. Judge Harrison flipped to the final thick page of the document. He physically held his breath. The silence in the room was so profound, I could hear the rain lashing against the windows. "This signature," the judge murmured, adjusting his glasses. "This is an irrevocable power of attorney, paired with a complete deed of assignment." "Exactly," Veronica said, her voice ringing out like a final bell. Before her passing, Linda Spencer executed a flawless legal transfer. She legally designated the position of supreme creditor of the entire Spencer empire to her granddaughter. Every single asset, every building, and every bank account Robert Spencer currently operates now belongs unequivocally to the young woman standing next to me. Robert collapsed. His legs simply gave out beneath him, and he crashed heavily into his leather chair, both of his knees trembling violently. He stared blankly at the floor, his chest heaving as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I could see his lips moving, frantically whispering my grandmother's name in pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized the brutal truth. The absolute life-or-death power over his legacy, his career, and his entire existence now rested squarely in the hands of the daughter he had ruthlessly trampled on for 20 years. Vance snapped out of his shock, his face flushing crimson. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an ambush. These documents must be fraudulent. We demand a recess to investigate these absurd claims," he stammered desperately, waving his hands wantonnly in the air. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel and brought it down with a thunderous strike. "Overruled. These documents carry the highest level of federal authentication. I am denying the plaintiff's request for the property transfer. Furthermore, based on the concrete evidence of illegal stock pledging detailed in these ledgers, I am officially ordering an immediate, comprehensive financial fraud investigation into Robert Spencer and his entire executive board. Court is adjourned." Total chaos erupted. My mother shrieked, clutching her designer pearls, her pristine image shattering into pathetic hysteria. Chloe was screaming wildly at the lawyers, demanding they fix it, demanding her trust fund be protected. They were losing their minds as the illusion of their wealth burned to the ground. I turned away from the bench. I picked up the battered leather briefcase and began walking down the aisle. As I passed the plaintiff's table, I stopped for one brief second. Robert looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, begging desperation. He was a broken, empty man. I looked down at him, my expression completely cold. "Money cannot buy the truth, Dad." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on him forever and walked out through the heavy oak doors, leaving the ruins of the Spencer Empire behind me. The heavy burden of betrayal and hatred that I had carried for years evaporated into the stormy air. By the time I drove back to the mountains, the rain had finally stopped. The thick gray clouds broke apart, allowing brilliant, warm rays of afternoon sunlight to pour over the lush green canopy. I returned to the quiet, sun-drenched wooden cabin. The bright orange surveyor tape had already been torn down and thrown into the garbage. Over the next several weeks, I focused purely on healing. I repaired the old wooden porch, meticulously restored my grandmother's vibrant flower garden, and watched the seasons change in absolute peace. I was no longer the outcast of a toxic dynasty. I was free. I had the power to fund the disaster relief teams for the next 50 years, and more importantly, I finally had a true home. Surrounded by the towering pines and the memory of the woman who saved me, I began to build a beautiful, entirely new definition of family for myself. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I truly appreciate your time and your wonderful support. Where are you listening to this story from today? Please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's story and found it meaningful, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or use the PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Your support gives our channel the budget to pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better and more exciting stories just for you. Have a wonderful and blessed day.